Welcome back to Highly Respected. I'm your host, Scott Greer. Today I'm joined by the internet poster known as Nemitz. Nemitz, how are you?
I'm doing well. Thanks for having me on tonight, Scott.
Yeah, thanks for coming on, man. We got a great subject for him today because Nemitz is an expert on Eastern Europe, and we're going to talk about the Russian Revolution, which is one of the most important events of the 20th century. It actually was two revolutions. I mean, most people should know this, but some people don't remember high school very well. The February Revolution was a mass uprising to displace the Tsarist regime and impose a weak liberal government. The October Revolution refers to the Bolshevik coup displacing the liberal provisional government. I just read an excellent book about this topic called The Russian Revolution, A New History by Sean McMeekin. So now I feel like an expert. Nemitz is an actual expert on the subject, and he and past highly respected guest Irkutanin have been posting a lot of valuable information about the Russian Revolution in recent weeks. So my first question, and it's a big one, what exactly caused the February Revolution of the entire 1917 revolution?
I mean, Russia was never a particularly stable government. Just like any autocratic regime, if there's failures, as there were many failures, especially in the Eastern Front with the advances of the militaries of the Central Powers, I mean, really just the Germans, and then just the general unrest in Central Asia, and then there were the issues with supplies. You had the, Tsar Nikolai II, he was, I believe, only something like 164th Russian. None of his ancestors in the previous, I believe, 170 years had actually been a Russian. They were all pretty much married various German and Danish and other princes from the European states. And
it was a foreign overlord class.
I'm sorry?
Yeah. A foreign overlord class, and most European monarchies were like this. I mean, they were international and cosmopolitan tone, and like you may be in Germany, and you may be in one country, and then your monarch is somebody who has barely any lineage to your country. And Russia also had a German upper class. Our Germans were heavily infiltrated in the upper class. And if you read any Russian histories of the Tsarist days, you'll be seeing a ton of German last names. And this became problematic during the war when Germanophobia was at a height, and they would have many of their leaders with German last names, and there's a lot of hatred directed towards them.
Yes, that's very true. And it wasn't just directed towards, kind of that upper echelon of the aristocracy and nobility that was heavily German. You had a lot of, like the Mennonite communities of Ukraine, which suffered as well. You had kind of early deportations further to the east due to, as the Germans were suspected of collaborating with some justification with the Central Powers.
Yeah, and a lot of the Baltic German community was more loyal to, that wasn't necessarily the entire German community, but a lot of the Baltic German community was more loyal to the German Empire than the Russians. And a lot of people who later, fled to Germany and joined the Nazi Party came from that Baltic community, such as Alfred Rosenberg, who was, who's always named as the Nazi ideologue. He was actually a Baltic German. And so were many in that community like that. They felt more German than Russian. German was their primary language. And of course, they had all these different communities within the Russian Empire that, Russians were actually, the ones who were speaking Russian, the Russian population was actually was a plurality in the empire. I believe they were only about 44%. And when taken together with what they call Little Russians, which is the Ukrainians, and White Russians, the Belarusians, they were about, I believe, 60% of the population, or a little bit more than that. So they were a majority with these ethnic communities that were similar to Russians. But as we see today, the Ukrainians, their main enemy is the Russians, so not always get together. So they had tremendous amounts of ethnic diversity in there. I mean, Poles, Finns, Baltic community, all these communities in Central Asia. They also had a German diaspora community, and all these people were had to form together to fight in a war. And some people have mentioned that all of these multiculturalism and ethnic diversity in these various empires in World War I, and not only in Russia, but also in the Ottoman Empire and the Austrian-Hungarian Empire, this was a crucial factor in their weakness and the reason why all three of them fell apart. How much importance do you place on Russia's diversity and multi-ethnic empire? Is that a cause for the revolutions that occurred?
I mean, you've got kind of two factors. You have the very short-term immediate issues where you have the revolutionary groups that wanted, say, like an independent Poland, independent Ukraine, independent Finland, independent Armenia. That used to be a very large one in the empire, as well as independent Georgia. So you have those immediate groups that are causing an issue, of which the Poles were by far the worst. And then you have the secondary effects where you have all these kind of disaffected peoples that they don't necessarily have any link to, it's autocracy, orthodoxy, and nationality, that is the ethnic Russian nationality. And, they're going to go for a different identity. So that's how you have groups as diverse and often antagonistic as each other as the Poles and the Jews of the Pale of Settlement, as well as the Georgians of the Caucasus, who kind of bond together in a kind of a broader identity that, one form of which became Bolshevism, kind of a proletarian internationalism. So you have those kind of two threads, tying in that weaken the Russian government.
Yeah, and this is not necessarily the most original take, but there's always been arguments that the Bolsheviks were a alienated minority, that they come from alienated minority communities, and the Nazis always accused them as like, oh, this is a Jewish revolution that they had, and the Bolsheviks were all Jews. Which, if you look at the leadership, yes, there were some Jews involved in leadership, such as Trotsky, Zinoviev. Correct, I pronounced it wrong, and Lenin himself was partially Jewish, but a lot of the ordinary Bolsheviks in there weren't necessarily part of the Jewish community, but they did come from other minorities in the Russian Empire who had their own axe to grind with the empire. They felt that they weren't being represented. So what are some of these, you're talking about that whether they were arguing for their own independent country, such as a lot of the Poles who gathered around Suzuki. And I'm probably butchering a lot of these names. I have no inherent knowledge of Slavic languages, so Nemitz can hopefully correct me on some of the pronunciations. But that you had, people who were divided on this. And where do you think that most of the support for the Bolsheviks came in Russian society?
I mean, the Bolsheviks came out of, originally they considered themselves social democrats. I don't think they really even gave up that name until 1919, I believe. I could be wrong. Originally they started off as they believed themselves to be a, kind of vanguard of the proletariat, but as far as the actual people that led it, they tended to be kind of the upper middle class or lower upper class, like Vladimir Lenin, his father, for instance, was a nobleman, who had done fairly successfully. Quite a few of them had been, merchants of one sort or another that were overeducated and, were either downwardly mobile or got in trouble for revolutionary agitation. So those were kind of the two classes that really dominated in Bolshevik leadership. And they actually found it very difficult to find peasants to go and actual proletarians to be part of the party and join in the leadership. Although as the war went on, they did gain, and conscript quite a few people with those backgrounds.
Yeah, and we'll go into this a bit, but actually the Bolsheviks were very anti-peasants, and most of the war, or during the Civil War phase, most of their efforts were directed at suppressing the peasants, peasant revolts, and requisitioning their grain and doing all types of atrocities against them. And actually, when they defeated the whites, they used all their military power to burning down, or like killing a lot of these peasants. And a lot of the Bolshevik leaders had a total contempt for the peasants as a backward reactionary class that hung on to their religion and were not ready to join the proletariat. So they felt that they had to make them join the system. But we'll touch that on that in a little bit. Now, there's one interesting point that McMeekin talks about as saying what was a major cause of the revolution. And he points to that the war was going so terribly and the people were like fed up and they were like, we want to end this war now. But he makes a more unique point about this, that many of the people who wanted the revolution and advocated for it wanted the war conducted more zealously, that they thought that the Tsar was too controlled by German elements, that there was a Prussian-occupied government element in the state. The Tsarina, of course, was German herself, and they thought that there was these Germans around them. I believe I don't think it's the name as the chancellor, but the chancellor at the time had a German last name, was an ethnic German, and they felt that they were not conducting the war as zealously as possible. And there was some almost nationalist sentiment guiding the initial February Revolution. And McMeekin says that the war wasn't actually going as badly as it's portrayed. I mean, of course, they were having problems with supplies. They were not in necessarily the position they were, but they were expected to make a major spring breakthrough. The Brusilov offensive in 1916 had regained a lot of ground. It was not as dire as, say, after the Battle of Tannenberg, and I believe that in 1915, and where they were suffering these major defeats and 100,000, Russian casualties in these battles. It wasn't as bleak as that point, but the war didn't look like it was going to be lost. But the Russians were much more eager for a peace in 1916 than the rest of the Allies. So what do you make of that, Artie? Do you think it is accurate to say that the war wasn't going as badly for Russia at that time, or was the Russians were bound to lose at some point in 1917?
No, they could have definitely won the war if they'd kept fighting, especially in the Caucasian front against the Turks. Ever since their victory at Sarikamish, the Turks had been basically disintegrating, even if they had won at Gallipoli. The Armenians were overwhelmingly in support of the Russians and were kind of hell-bent on carving up the Ottoman Empire from the east. And there's also going to be a naval invasion launched from what's nowadays southern Ukraine and Crimea that was going to sail across the Black Sea and seize Constantinople from the Turks and knock out that entire southern front.
That's right. It would have been the dream of all internet right-wingers to have Constantinople returned to Christian hands and into the Russian Empire, but it was not to be due to the revolutions.
Yeah, everything was unfortunately shelved due to the revolution and all the issues that caused with discipline. As far as what caused the revolution itself, I mean, the issue with autocracy is you have kind of a top-down government that doesn't have participatory structures where people feel vested within the government itself. Now, I mean, on one hand, you can get a lot of things done without having, getting stuck in the bureaucracy like, some American politicians do. But on the other hand, you do have a lot of people with wealth, with influence, with support that do feel left out and do want an alternative form of government. And in General Pyotr Wrangel, he was one of the noted white generals who fought against the Bolsheviks and others in the Civil War. He was well aware of this, and even though he supported the Tsar, he discusses in his memoirs, always with honor, just how rare his position was and how pretty much overwhelmingly the officer corps, the general staff, and particularly the highly educated people of the Russian Empire all wanted a switch to, at the very least, a more democratic structure, even if the monarchy itself wasn't going to be done away with. And just with kind of the issues with Rasputin, with finances, with kind of the unrest in Petersburg, with the left-wingers, many of them kind of saw that as their opportunity where they could topple the Tsar and establish some sort of constitutional monarchy or a republic.
Yeah, and there was a lot of right-wing elements initially who were upset with the Tsar, and some of that fervent was leading to the February Revolution. Of course, Rasputin was killed in the winter of December of 1916 by what would be described as conservative elements in the government who thought that he was proving a negative influence. And Rasputin actually opposed the war and was one of the few voices that the Tsar would have heard in 1914, warning him to not be pushing for war. Pretty much the entire cabinet and everyone else he was listening to wanted war. Only Rasputin was opposed to it, but he wasn't around at the time that they were having the war discussions. And conservative elements in the government murdered him, and they felt that the Tsar was being weak and that they needed to persecute the war more zealously. And so some of that ferment, they necessarily didn't agree with what happened. They definitely didn't want Kerensky and all the left liberals taking charge. But at the same time, they realized the Tsar was weak. I mean, Nicholas II wasn't exactly the greatest ruler at the time, and it was the same with a lot of these monarchs. Is you had the problem is that if you have an incompetent person at top who doesn't really know what to do and he has terrible advisors, then your country can get into a gigantic mess that it can't get out of. And in a lot of the what happened with the revolution of leading up to it is that the Tsar took too long to arrive to St. Petersburg, and he was getting delayed, and then he was like having idiotic advisors telling him stuff, and that it just all led to the toppling of the Romanovs. So partially one of the reasons is that their own incompetence. So how much blame can we put on the Romanovs for causing their own demise? Because some people on the right really have, any monarchy they just love, and they're like, oh, they were blameless. They were doing so good things. They were a true Christian monarch. And how dare would anyone oppose them? When a lot of these people from Louis XVI to Nicholas II were wildly incompetent rulers that doesn't necessarily justify what happened to them. But how much can we blame the Romanovs for what happened to themselves?
I think we can put most of the blame onto them. They had plenty of opportunities, even going back to the 1820s, to have more you could even argue the 1770s with Catherine the Great in the response to the Pugachev uprising. They had plenty of opportunities for more representative democratic structures. They could have developed parties that would have incorporated local elites into, kind of the process of government and aligned them with the monarchy as well as the country. With a few exceptions, they largely stayed true to the autocracy, unlike the other European governments. Even Germany, which was viewed as relatively reactionary by the Western European states, was far more democratic than the Russian Empire was.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, that's one of the points that the American isolationists made. Many of them ethnic Germans themselves, against going to war with Germany. They argued that Germany was a relatively more progressive nation compared to the Russians.
Yeah, and the German imperial state was a model to a lot of American progressive thinkers, and American academics love to go to Germany to study to get their PhDs. German academic methods were brought to America. A lot of America's intelligentsia in the early 20th century were Germanophiles. They loved the Germans. It wasn't really until World War I that this changed. And yeah, in Germany, they had to at least work with parliamentary or parliament and work with the civilian leaders to get what was done. And ultimately, a lot of what happened with Germany and its turn to a kind of dictatorship was them relying entirely on the military. And at the end in 1917 and 1918 on Hindenburg and Ludendorff, who just decided to rule by decree, and they got everything they want, and the civilian leaders were pushed aside. And of course, the emperor, the Kaiser, was like Nicholas, not really a good leader and fairly weak, and people didn't respect him, and he was pushed aside, and the military was running everything, and they didn't. They made a lot of stupid political decisions that ultimately led to their to the catastrophe in November of 1918. So yeah, they were, to go to your point, is that the system that Russia had was totally out of line with what all the rest of the West had. There were Imperial Germany, as you were saying, was not the emperor just couldn't order someone shot that day, and not necessarily the Tsar. The Imperial Russia wasn't as oppressive as people think. Most of the literature will say that far fewer people were executed under the Tsarist system in like a 20-year period than was killed in like a month under the Bolsheviks. It was not that oppressive. Most of the leading dissidents weren't shot. They were shipped out to Siberia, where they were essentially put in like a winter vacation home where they didn't have any communications or technology, of course, because it's Siberia in the early 20th century and they're cut off from the world. But it was just really boring, and it was not exactly something you wanted to do, but it wasn't exactly this horrific concentration camp the czars were putting you in. It was just keeping you out of the country. And there is some part that the reason why they had all these crazy dissidents running around is that the czar system wasn't targeting them enough. It wasn't like, it was not offering real solutions. It was like welcoming them back. It was allowing them to go to Siberia where they could easily escape and they could mingle with their old comrades back in St. Petersburg or Moscow. And they really kept all these crazy people. They weren't very good at actually controlling them. And that happened in course in the unrest of 1905, which was always seen as a precursor to the Russian Revolution, that all these crazy people were almost able to topple the government then, and that this just became more of a problem by 1917, is that this wasn't exactly a competent government ruled by the best people. It was just people who happen to know the czar.
Yeah, that's very true. And I think a lot of the attempts to kind of whitewash the Russian Empire and the Tsarist rule, it's true that the official statistics for executions were relatively low, but especially in the 1905, 1906 unrest and attempted revolution, there were right-wing death squads that were going out.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, the Black Hundreds and others who were just going around. And there was and also the one thing that they always blame on the imperial state is the pogroms that, of course, led to a lot of the Jewish immigration to America. A lot of that was due to this disorder, or the complete disorder of how the imperial state couldn't control its population. Is that the imperial state and certain imperial officials were encouraging it, but at the same time, the imperial state was like, "This is really bad. We can't control our own people," and they're just going out and killing whoever they want. It was just like almost a madhouse state in some of this, but the imperial state could also be brutal if it needed to be. It had the power to just shoot civilians, because the unrest in 1905 was started by soldiers just like massacring hundreds of protesters in the streets. And other governments could not do that. The Imperial Germany could not just tell soldiers to let it loose on protesters. Only Imperial Russia could they do that. And it was at both times brutal and weak, which is a terrible combination if you're trying to retain power. I mean, if people see you as brutal and oppressive, at the same time they can't control violence and public disorders, that's a recipe for disaster.
Yes, that's definitely very true. And, that's the other issue with theocracy. They had all these potential supporters, whether the Black Hundreds, the various unions of monarchists. They had, really Black Hundreds is kind of a catch-all term for many, many different groups. You had the Union of Russian People. All these groups, and a lot of times they weren't even necessarily ethnic Russians. Like you had Tatars that were part of the Black Hundreds, like Turkic Muslims. Western Ukraine, which is now
Orthodox Muslims coming together for one struggle for the Tsar. And the Tatars are historically were a horrific enemy of Europe. They were throughout most of the time and throughout the 17th and 18th century, they were kidnapping people from European Christians and selling them to slave markets and to the Turks. And this happened to tens of thousands of Europeans, and people lived in fear of the Tatars throughout Europe. And this could extend there was even Austrians and Germans who were being kidnapped and sold into slavery, which, at the same time, when we have to always bemoan the horrible plight that happened to Africans, because slavery has never happened to any group of people in the world except for Africans in America. There were, hundreds of thousands of Europeans who were at risk of being sold into slavery, either by Barbary pirates or Tartars or other agents of the Turkish Empire. And you know what? They don't talk about this in public schools. This is one of those elements. But, that's a digression that has not that much to do with Russian Revolution, but just an interesting fact about history. So I think, most people can see the Tsarist regime as it's something that was almost, it was, of course, not great what followed it, to put it mildly. But it was a weak regime that it had many problems, and people kind of almost need to overlook their own admiration for, I guess, monarchy or base monarchy that a lot of people on the right have, and see that there were serious problems with the Romanov dynasty and with its rulers that they had at the time.
I couldn't have put it better myself.
hopefully, but one of the points that I want to talk to, that it's a little going back a little bit further from the Russian Revolution and to the origins of World War I, is that McMeekin, in both the Russian Revolution book and in some other books that he has written about, that our good friend Irkutanen has been posting about on Twitter, he actually puts a lot of the blame for the start of World War I on Russia, which traditionally everyone blames Germany, which is part of Victor's right history, and they blame the losers for everything. And they're just saying, oh, their diplomatic decisions, they were going for war, unlike us peaceful British and French. This is all Germany's fault. So what do you make of the argument that Russia deserves a lot of the blame for the start? I mean, most people will agree that everyone shares a little bit of the blame, but Germany deserves a lion's share of the blame. What do you think that maybe Russia is actually the real instigator of the war?
I mean, I think the war was more or less inevitable. It was going to happen. There were a lot of different powder kegs, whether it was Poland, whether it was the Caucasus, whether it was, Turkey's decay. The Turks had fought. There had been 2 Balkan wars fought several years before World War I, which involved large population transfers of Bulgarians, Greeks, Albanians, Serbs or Macedonians, as well as Turks in the Balkans. You had ongoing persecutions of Armenians in the Ottoman Empire. You had, there were stirrings of unrest in the Central Asian states, which the British and Turks played a small role in, but probably could have gotten dragged into had things gone further with the Russian Empire. And, similarly, the Russians were, and the Germans as well, were involved in Afghanistan, Iran, and India, and undermining the British Empire there. So you had a lot of different things that could have set it off. It just happened to be the status of Serbia in our universe. I mean, in the long run, something was going to happen, and most likely it was going to take place in either the Russian or the Ottoman Empire.
Yeah, and I think that if you read any of histories from basically from the Franco-Prussian War onward, there was always the chance for a continental-wide conflict over anything, because Germany you have this major power emerge from these disparate states that under the Congress of Vienna, they was supposed to, what is now Germany was supposed to be divided between people, and now is united into one powerful state, and of course that caused some disruptions in the continent. So if you read any history, there's all these conflicts that are setting off, but they had skilled diplomats such as Bismarck and others who were able to work through these problems before, to make sure that they didn't lead to a major conflict. And then after Bismarck's departure in 1890, these things kept escalating and getting more serious with worse resolutions that 20 years prior, they would actually have a serious solution that everyone would come to terms with, and there wouldn't be a problem for 10 or so years. But from 1890 onward, there was all these problems, and they didn't have a serious resolution. So there was bound to be a conflict. Everyone was building up for war throughout at the beginning of the 20th century and onward to 1914, and people were eager for it. They did not like how Germany was becoming a major power, and Germany itself was eager to assert its dominance on the world stage, which all the other world powers were trying to resist. So there was several issues coming at it. And I think even a lot of modern history still like to place the blame at the Kaiser's feet. It is an equally shared blame that we can put at England and France as well as Russia. So that, equal opportunity blame for everyone involved. Now on to the Bolsheviks. They were surprisingly enough, a very minor faction prior to 1917. Not that many Russians knew who the hell Lenin was, and the major left-wing faction were the Socialist Revolutionaries. I got the name. I'm pretty sure I got the name. Yeah, the Socialist Revolutionaries, who, despite their name, were actually far more moderate than the Bolsheviks, who were called the Social Democrats. People in Russia did not stick to their terminology correctly. And they were a very minor party before, and they played very little role in the February Revolution. But by the time of October rolled around, they were the most powerful faction in Russia, or at least on the Russian left. How did that occur?
It's kind of a long story. Russia, just like all other medieval countries, had issues with, clashes between the peasants and the nobility, just like every other country did. And, most of these countries, like Britain, they'd resolved kind of this peasant unrest. Like Britain resolved it with the Highland clearances, deporting a lot of the unruly Scotsmen and the Highlanders to America. You have in Germany, you have the state sponsorship of the various agricultural estates in the eastern states, which kind of stabilized those. And you also had tremendous immigration. Russia had some immigration, both to Central Asia, Siberia, and to the United States as well. However, there's still a lot of peasant immiseration in the rural areas, both, through the medieval period into the 20th century. And you had kind of the conflict between the different various radical groups. And some of these groups, the populists, they were they had a wide variety of beliefs. Some of them were anarchists, some of them were anarcho-syndicalists. Some of them would be recognizable as communists or utopians, and some of them were kind of nationalists that we could recognize as predecessors to fascists in a way. In these groups, they loathed the Tsar and kind of stirred up rural unrest, throughout the 18th and 19th centuries. And some groups, like the Socialist Revolutionaries, they were kind of influenced by these groups. And the Bolsheviks were unique in that even though they had some influences, they did go and reject them in favor of a dictatorship of the proletariat rather than a democratic, largely peasant-based agricultural society. So the Bolsheviks focused a lot of their organizing efforts on the town councils, the Soviets, which literally means like the advice council or town council. And they had all sorts of Soviets. They had the worker Soviets for various factories. They would have like neighborhoods organized into these things. And they really focused on organizing these. They emphasized all power to the Soviets. They viewed them as, said they were more democratic than the provisional government, which tended to be more from the bourgeoisie and the upper classes. And, ultimately kind of a rural landholder and academic that would be elected in a democratic election isn't going to have the same kind of influence that, like your local factory boss or union man is going to have. And that was kind of the Bolshevik advantage over the socialist revolutionaries, who I'll just call the SRs. That's the Russian short name for them, for SR, Socialist Revolutionary. So those kind of their advantages. They were able to take control of the big cities. They controlled the factories. They could control the shipping. They had access to a lot of the capital, a lot of it from the Germans, who were very generous in donating to them. And they also financed a lot of their stuff through bank robberies too, which the more rural denizens of the empire did not have. So that was in my opinion, the main advantage the Bolsheviks had.
Yeah, and on your Imperial German point, yes, they received a ton of money from the German imperial government, which allowed them to print out more propaganda than anyone else because they had all this money and they were able to pay the printers to keep pumping out pamphlets for soldiers and cause mutinies and get their message out far more than any other left-wing group. So that certainly helped them. And a lot of people don't necessarily acknowledge this fact of how much the Germans were responsible for the Bolshevik Revolution, at least on the right, because a lot of people love the Imperial German state, they love Prussian militarism, Prussian values. Yet at the same time, the Imperial Germans were arguably one of the parties most responsible, at least from a foreign perspective, of helping the Bolsheviks along. They didn't only help them with money; they also help them with troop deployments and all their aid that kept the Bolsheviks afloat. If they didn't have German support, they would have likely collapsed after they took power in October. But that didn't last for long, because by the time near the end of the war, Germany, Ludendorff has been reading the news reports of what was coming out of Russia. He's like, these guys are maniacs. We have to wipe them out. We cannot trust them. We just have to take them out entirely. And they were on their way to crush the Bolsheviks government, but the Allies broke through on the Western Front, and that didn't happen, and the German state fell. So what caused this change? What is some of the reason that caused this change? And what was Germany's calculation for supporting these crazy left-wing radicals, which in Imperial Germany, they had banned, the Socialist Party had been banned for many years, and the Social Democratic Party of Germany was far more moderate than the Bolsheviks. They were not necessarily causing, their leaders were not causing for revolution. They were just simply calling for reform and minor changes, and they were wanting to work within the system. They were not calling for the downfall of the Tsar, or the Kaiser rather. While the Bolsheviks were extremely radical and were wanting down with the Tsar, down with the whole system. We want the end the war. Unlike all other factions, they wanted a total end to the war. They didn't care what concessions they got from Germany. They wanted it end immediately. So what caused this change for Germany, and why did they initially support Lenin and the Bolsheviks?
The Germans and as well as the Habsburgs had supported a very large number of, I guess, subversives in the Russian Empire. Like you have Joseph Pilsudski, who later became leader of Poland for a while. He was supported by the Central Powers long before. I believe he was involved in some bank raids too with the socialist revolutionaries. I think there might have been some Bolsheviks involved in that too, but I can't remember. They supported all sorts of groups, whether it was, the Finns, for instance. The people who came up with Finnish nationalism were largely not Finns. They were mostly Germans and Swedes who resented losing their privileged status in Finland to the new Russian Empire once the Russian Empire took them over from the Swedes.
I think Mannerheim is a Swede. Was ethnically Swede. Mannerheim was, of course, the great general who helped lead Polish independence following the chaos in Russia. But I believe he was a Swede, or if I'm not mistaken.
Yes, I mean, a lot of those guys that were kind of a mix of Danish, Swedish, and German. But ever since the 19th century, the German element had been predominating over the Swedish element due to the, you just have so much more German shipping than Swedish shipping in the region.
Yeah, so they had all this influence with it. And we still kind of see this today with various foreign governments supporting subversives in various countries, as we saw throughout the Cold War, which communists were supporting communist parties throughout Europe, and we would support people who were trying to undermine communist governments. And even this carries on today, even though the United States apparently doesn't meddle in elections or anything like that. But we always carry on with our mission. So this is normal foreign diplomacy. But at times, the people you're supporting may end up biting in the back, and that you may come to regret this decision. America has seen this countless times where people we have backed later turn out to be our enemies, such as Osama bin Laden. So you could say that the German support of Lenin was similar to our support of the Mujahideen in Afghanistan in the 1980s, where we're supporting people that our immediate enemy was Russia or the Soviet Union, and we were just supporting who was ever fighting them. And later on, we led to the development of Islamic terrorism, which we're still fighting today. And a lot of that comes from the Afghanistan conflict. And with the Germans, they didn't have a long-term vision of what was going to happen with the Bolsheviks. They just saw this as, they're knocking out Russia out of the war. Great, that's what we're most concerned with. And then they see the Bolsheviks are spreading subversive literature among their own troops, telling them to revolt, and they're like, hey, wait a minute, what is this? What's going on here? And then, sure enough, they had 70 years, over 70 years of communist dictatorship in Russia, in large part to their activities. So this is something that you have a short-term goal that you want. And if that accomplishes it, it creates something far worse than what you were fighting against. So some of our leaders haven't learned that lesson, even after almost actually over 100 years after the fact. But as I was mentioning previously, the Bolsheviks had tremendous adversity that they were facing. They had supply cuts. The entire world was against them. There was several factions that were going to war against them. They had massive strikes going on. Banks were giving them money. How did they overcome this tremendous adversity? Because the previous leadership, under Kerensky, they got wiped out. What made the Bolsheviks different, and how did they survive all of this crap that was coming their way?
I mean, it's a mix of a lot of different factors. The white movement, which wasn't really a movement, it was more of a collection of several different warlords, and at various periods had different amounts of unity, was never really a coherent force. For brief periods, they were able to come up with a broad front, but most of the time they were just kind of scattered armies here and there, whereas the Bolsheviks controlled kind of the heart of Russia from St. Petersburg to Moscow, and they were able to suppress pretty much anyone that tried to take over their core territory, even if the war elsewhere kind of ebbed back and forth. And I think that was the main reason why they won. They just had more people in core Russia than the others could come up with in Ukraine, in South Russia, in the Volga, and in Siberia.
And would you say that they had better leaders, or is that just an accident of history of that it didn't matter who necessarily the leaders were, is just having those resources and those locations that they were bound to win?
I mean, it's more organization than anything. What they would do, they created their commissars, where they would have a political officer in each unit to make sure they could watch the regular officer, and the regular officer would often just be a demobilized officer from the Tsarist era. So they're able to put together a lot of the old Imperial Army and the new Red Army, to go and fight the White Army.
Yeah, which is an odd fact of showing the militaries. Of the military, a lot of these guys who were diehard Tsarist just a few years before were Bolshevik, were in the Red Army about 2 years later, which is something odd that, like, you could see these military officers that they've been raised in a certain regime and with a certain values, that they would discard it just by the fact that the Bolsheviks are fighting for Russia. One of the propaganda items that really helped the Bolsheviks, especially after the Germans collapsed, is that they were the ones fighting for Russia, and that everyone else was being controlled by foreign adversaries. That the Britain and France and America are coming and invading us, and the whites are on their side, and we're defending Russia. And it's very, strange, twisted events. This group that was very anti-nationalistic and internationalist and orientation in 1917 turned into were claiming themselves as the true nationalists, the ones who are fighting to defend Mother Russia in 1919. And this helped win them over a lot of ordinary Russians who didn't like these foreign enemies coming in. They may have not liked the Bolsheviks, but they said, like, well, we don't want to be under foreign oppression, and we think that the other side is controlled by our global adversaries. So it is a strange, and this happened several times throughout the Civil Wars, that one side would use rhetoric that you wouldn't think that the other side would be doing. And the whites are always portrayed as these horrible reactionaries who just wanted the czar back, and pretty much most of them didn't. But this was presenting problems with obtaining support in the West, because Woodrow Wilson, in his idealistic ways, was demanding that the whites insist on having a democracy. And even though most of them were wanting to get past the Tsarist regime, Woodrow Wilson still thought that they were counter-revolutionaries and arch-reactionaries. So, going along with how did the Bolsheviks win, why did the whites lose?
They never, one, they just kind of controlled the frontiers of the country, Siberia, the Volga, South Russia with the Cossacks, parts of Ukraine. Part of it was that the Central Powers occupied some of the more productive parts of like a lot of Western Ukraine, for instance, and Bohemia tended to be very strongly pro-Russian up until the Central Powers reoccupied the region when they were storming through after the collapse of the Russian government. And a lot of those Russians that would have otherwise provided kind of the resource bases of the Dnieper ended up fleeing far to the east, where they were far less valuable. And then you had kind of a conflict of ideologies too. You had socialist revolutionaries, which would cooperate with monarchists, even though they had nothing in common. And then the one of them would inevitably betray the other one. So you had units that would constantly change sides. That was the case, especially in the East, where you'd have, like in Central Asia, the Bolsheviks took control of one of these cities there. I think it was Bukhara, and which is a largely Muslim city inhabited by Uzbeks and Tajiks. And the socialist revolutionaries that controlled the railway were very unhappy with the way that the Bolsheviks ran things, especially with requisitioning of food supplies. So they re-allied with the Whites. The Whites took over, and the Whites went, and their leader was just a staunch monarchist who refused to take any of the concerns of the workers seriously. And so the socialist revolutionaries changed their minds again and joined forces with the Reds. And that happened several times in Siberia and the Volga, and it really undermined the cause of the Whites.
Yeah, and one of there's so much factions going on is that there was a group of Czech prisoners of war from the Austria. They were fighting for Austro-Hungarian Empire, and that they were trying to get back to Czechoslovakia. That switched sides to declare Czechoslovakia independence, and they didn't necessarily make it, but they were causing tons of chaos within Russia and conquering entire regions. And they were still a problem with it, and they were also not unsure of which side that they should be on, and they would have changing sides and in the end of the war they were just trying to get home. So then there were several other POW groups or groups that were outside of the typical Russian nationality that were also fighting within the war, and they were fighting for their own interests and either trying to get home or fighting for their homeland, and they were just fighting for whatever side seemed most amicable to their cause. So there's tons and tons of chaos going on in 1917, 1918 Russia. And going back on to the bigger picture that was with this is that I've encountered the argument that says that the Russian Revolution, rather than World War II, should be seen as the central event of the 20th century. What do you make of that argument?
I think it's largely true in the same sense that the French Revolution was the most important event of the 18th century. You have, these old autocratic societies, which are in various forms of democratization and the development of political parties where the bourgeoisie and the capitalists can participate in politics, as well as labor movements. And, in some areas they were completely successfully integrated in the system, like they were in Britain with the triumph of the Labour Party a few years into the 1920s. And then in other places like Russia, it just wasn't developed at all. You had a lot of these political parties, which were essentially bandits and terrorists. And, they had a political program, but no actual influence in anything up until the 1905-1906 revolution and the subsequent creation of the Duma, Russia's version of Congress. Now, 1917 represents the triumph of one of the modernization models of the 20th century. You have the Communist Party state, which became a model for what would later happen in China, in half of Korea, Vietnam, and Cambodia, many other countries, both successfully and unsuccessfully, where you would have a group of disaffected bourgeoisie or downwardly mobile, members of the upper class that would organize either an urban proletariat like the Bolsheviks or rural peasantry like the Maoists in China, to create a single party state that would collectivize the land and kind of bring things into modernity, where you would have, rather than our system where people vote in their representatives, you would have a party model where local party officials would represent the locals to the higher ups. And that's something that the autocracies didn't have. They just had kind of a top-down bureaucracy. And the people down at the bottom didn't really have any way of voicing their opinions or becoming involved in the power structure.
Yeah, and another thing there, you're saying that like the Bolshevik Revolution caused international communists and all these communist regimes that emerged, many of them still exist today, is that it also in Europe, it did lead to the rise of fascism due to the fear of communism. Most of the bourgeoisie are middle class. I don't, sometimes I feel a little uncomfortable saying the bourgeoisie. Many of the middle class people in Germany and Italy turned to fascists as a way of defending themselves from the communist threat. And without the threat of communism, you wouldn't have had fascism. And without fascism, you wouldn't have had World War II. And this all led back to the Bolshevik Revolution, and that the fears of that this could happen in our country and we have to do something about it. We have to propose something that will address some of the concerns that the communists are saying, but do it in a different direction. That's what led to fascism. That's what led to the war. And, it is an event that, set all these things in motion. And it's at an event, the Cold War, which dominated most of pretty much the entirety of the second half of the 20th century and on. So, yeah, I think that there is a lot of argument to be said about the Revolutionary Revolution being the central event, but there is far less interest in it in America in general than World War II. I mean, everything is based around World War II. Whenever politicians talk, you're a Nazi or you're Neville Chamberlain, and this is like storming D-Day. These are pretty much the only three historical references ever made in American public life, and that's even the same in Europe as well, as some of my European friends have said. Is that they'll have politicians there who accuse each other of being Nazis and Neville Chamberlain, and then imagine themselves as the brave Allied troops fighting for them. And in Russia, the Great Patriotic War forms the central event of the Russian state, and it's something that they celebrate in almost religious terms. So the public perception is that World War II, but it short shrifts all these other events that were at least as equally important, or set everything in motion that impacted the rest of the 20th century. But it all comes back to World War II, which maybe it's America-dominated position, but it's also because both America and Russia would rather focus on World War II rather than the Russian Revolution for various reasons, or that's at least in my opinion. But going back to another modern perspective on the Russian Revolution is many of the people on the left and the right who like to say they're revolutionaries, and there's certainly a lot of people saying this on Twitter because, of course, that's the place to announce you're a revolutionary, dream of staging a revolution along the lines of the Russian Revolution. Do you think this is even possible in the 21st century West?
I mean, I think something like 30% of Americans are obese, and there's probably a much larger fraction of Americans that are overweight. I don't really think there's going to be a revolution. People just aren't physically capable of it.
What but people will take to the streets? They will see the last thing when they take away sports ball. That's when they take to the streets, or when they see some grave injustice. That's when they're going to go. One of the funniest scenes I've ever seen in a movie is V for Vendetta. Where I assume you have seen it, maybe you haven't, but in this movie, it's all these like middle class people sitting in their comfortable living room watching like a flat screen TV, and they're watching like various disturbances on the street, and they're just so upset by it. They're like, I can't believe this is happening. Our government's actually tyrannical because this dude with a Guy Fawkes mask on is telling me so, and he's hijacking it. So I'm going to go out in the streets, and all these people who are unaffiliated with any groups, they're unorganized, and they're all clearly living comfortable middle-class existences with high-end technology and great TV, and everything looks happy with their lives, that they're just so upset by what the Guy Fawkes mask dude is telling them that they go out into the streets and they take down their government. And a lot of Americans have this perception that, all these people living in the suburban cul-de-sacs will just like one day pick up their guns, unprompted. There's just some event and they'll go out in the streets. Now, we have seen this in the wake of the George Floyd protests, where tons and tons of people have taken the streets and firebombed federal courthouses and torn down statues and essentially taken over parts of many cities. But it's almost the government's allowing them to do that. They're not really threatening power by doing this. threatening people without power, because all of this is directed against the silent majority of middle America, the historic American nation. This is a violence against people who voted against Trump. It's not violence against people in power. People in power do not feel threatened by what's going on. They feel that they see this as an opportunity to gain more power, as that what we're seeing right now with, new speech, almost type of speech codes that are being proposed. The type of controls where you have to wear a mask even outside, and there's these strict regulations. I just saw that Los Angeles city government has now authorized the turning off of water and electricity to houses that are rumored to have large house parties. So there's a greater degree of control happening, and the protests aren't really challenging power and authority. And if they did, our government would have the ability to crack down on them. And even if you're looking at the Portland situation, this is Trump using one government, one of the few government agencies that's loyal to him, the Department of Homeland Security, and a lot of those guys are Border Patrol agents, against a bunch of rioters who have the backing of the Democratic Party, the media, celebrities, most of the intelligence community, because the FBI didn't want to get involved at all in the Portland situation. And all they can really do is protect the courthouse in the weakest way possible. If they went out there and charged them with tear gas, all the media cry that this is like Nazi Germany, once again proving that we only have a handful of historical references and they all have to deal with World War II. And they really couldn't crack down on it. So, but if they were a threat to the government, or the government perceived them as a threat, they could, do whatever they wanted to them, and they could throw them in jail and arrest the leaders, and it would end. And most people don't, unless they feel like they have the moral high stature that these left-wing protesters and BLM and Antifa have, they're not going to risk life and limb for a revolution or civil war, especially when they can sit in their comfy couch and turn on the TV, watch some Netflix and everything. They're like the person in V for Vendetta that is enjoying life, but for some reason they just decide to risk that all to go out in the streets because a guy Fox Bass told them to. So maybe I'm wrong at some points. What do you think, Nemitz?
No, I think that sounds about right. I mean, here in Los Angeles, they had some fairly large protests. I think we had a COVID outbreak was a bit worse than it would have been otherwise had there not been those protests. But at the same time, LAPD, the local city government, everyone kept everything under control, just kind of let them get away with a bit of ceremonial looting. And even those guys, I think they arrested quite a few of them. So I think Portland's a little bit different since they have a larger anarchist scene there, and it's not nearly as important a city as Los Angeles. So I think our leadership is more okay with Portland and Minneapolis being burned, but real power centers aren't going to be touched at all, like Los Angeles.
Yeah, the city government's fine with it. I mean, the mayor went out in Portland. He was getting maced by the protesters. They were throwing bottles at him, and he had to flee into a building. And he was still saying, like, these guys are totally peaceful, as he's got like a full water bottle being thrown at his head. And he's like, I love these guys. It's all the federal government. He would not denounce these people, even though they were literally trying to kill him. And the rest of the city population is totally on their side, even though they can't go to their businesses. They're seeing their window, they can't go into that area at all. And there's like fires everywhere. They're still on their side because of Orange Man is bad. And that's a powerful element. But that's, Trump is not the real power structure of this country. I mean, they are kind of, some people have insisted on Twitter that this is a kind of color revolution, which it is, but it's not really displacing Trump, but it is showing that Trump is not in charge, that other people are in charge. And it is important to note that all the censorship that's been happening to Trump happened at the start of there was already a buildup, but the really flagrant and overt censorship, which we're now seeing, now at the time of recording, Twitter has now suspended a Trump campaign account and is demanding they delete a tweet before they can start tweeting again. This is the president of the United States campaign account, and Twitter feels like they have the power to just bully him around. And I think this is a large part in the cause of these George Floyd riots and protests, that it's the real powers asserting their authority. I don't think necessarily the protesters are set up or it's astroturf. I think they're actually that delusional and that idiotic to go out and believe George Floyd is some great martyr. But the real powers that be have exploited the situation to enhance and secure their power against threats that they see embodied in Donald Trump. So that is, the conclusion to our discussion about Russian Revolution. Now on to the Patron questions. As a reminder, you can get the power to ask me questions if you sign up for the Patron option at Highly Respected's Patreon. We've got 2 today. This question comes from Tim. Quote, what do you make of Chris Kobach's loss? Is this a major defeat for Trumpism? Now, a lot of people were really bummed out about Chris Kobach losing his election on Tuesday. I want to give some, temper it a little bit. I mean, so many people are like, oh, there's no way we can have American first nationalism triumph in this country. It's all doomed. Like the cucks are winning and the establishment is winning. I mean, well, yes, that happened in that case, but there has to be a look at the individual case with this election. Chris Kobach is not really a good politician. He looks like a good politician, but he's really wonky. He's really into the ideas. He's not really that great at the meet and greet and the rough details of being a politician. He's not that really good at donor relations. There's several problems with him being a candidate. And in terms of like his charisma level, he doesn't really have a populist energy. He's a wonky guy who really cares about policy and drafting great policy. And I don't think there's been any person who's drawn up better immigration policy than Chris Kobach. And he is a real asset in that regard. He is not as much of an asset when it comes to being a politician, which people see him. He's like a good-looking guy. He seems to play the role. As Trump would say, he looks straight out of central casting, but unfortunately, he's not that great of a politician. And he had lost in 2018. And Republicans, rather than really saying like, oh, we can't have this guy, he's going to eliminate immigration entirely, and that's terrible, they really focus on this guy's going to lose an easy seat in November, and we have to keep this seat for Trump and to protect ourselves from Democratic tyranny. And that message really worked. And immigration is not as important of an issue in Kansas. It doesn't have as much immigration as, say, Arizona or Texas or plenty of places throughout the Southeast. It doesn't really have that much immigration. Most of its farming is mechanized. So they don't really have that issue. And they were just really mostly concerned with winning the election. And the establishment poured in millions and millions of dollars. And there's this dynamic under Trump. We saw throughout the Obama era, Tea Party candidates going up against the establishment and in many cases winning. It's hard to have these challenges now because both sides of these campaigns are saying, I'm the real Trumpist, I'm the real guy, I'm the real Trump supporter. And you even saw that in Alabama with Jeff Sessions versus Tommy Tuberville, is that they were both saying like, no, I'm the real Trumpist. And they went with the guy who was actually endorsed by Trump. The one case and there's several cases where people aren't really build narratives around nationalists versus globalists or nationalists for the establishment. There's not really a nationalist infrastructure that has been built out there like there was for the Tea Party, and that was very distinctive and could say that we're not the establishment and we have these set of values that are different. Both sides are competing to say they're the same thing. The only race where I'm seeing a establishment versus a conservative challenger that's playing out like it was in 2014 is in the Tennessee primary, which is Manny Sethi, who's the challenger. He's an Indian doctor, and he's facing off against the establishment guy, which is Bill Hagerty, who is a former ambassador to Japan, I believe, under Trump. And Bill Hagerty has gotten Trump's endorsement. Hagerty is the establishment guy, and Manny Sethi is actually running a pretty good campaign with the endorsements of several big conservative personalities and the support of Ted Cruz and others, and a lot of money coming in. And he's portraying himself as this challenger. But this race is one of the few races that looks nothing like other 2020 races where everyone's just trying to be the real Trumpists. It really is like a race from like 2014 where Manny Sethi is like saying this guy is really for amnesty and big government. And the other guy is like, well, we got to vote for the establishment. it's a very odd race that I think could only happen under those circumstances. So I think depending on what happens in the race, I think there will be, in the 2020 race, I think there will be more nationalist candidates. This is what's popular right now. This is what people, Republican politicians are listening to. Tucker Carlson is spreading a nationalist message every night from Fox News to over 4 million viewers. Republican politicians are listening. They're adopting to it. The problem is they're not genuine. They are not genuine believers like Chris Kobach and Jeff Sessions. But I believe we will have people like that emerge in the coming years. So you shouldn't be too despondent about it. There's a lot to be despondent about because both Steve King, Jeff Sessions, and Chris Kobach all lost. But there will be people to replace them. This stuff is more popular than it ever was when these guys were actually holding office. And that is one of the weird factors about this. And the people that they're losing to are having to pretend they're nationalists. So there are, one step back, one step forward. And you just have to keep moving along. I wouldn't get too despondent about it. Now, the second question comes from a person known as D-Man. Quote, the Justice Democrats won big on Tuesday and beat multiple establishment candidates. Do you think they will form a House Freedom Caucus style group on Capitol Hill soon? Well, I don't think they have enough members yet. I think they have the 4 squad members. And there's a few other progressives who aren't, necessarily part of the squad, like Pramila Jayapal, Rohana, some other people who are like that, who are basically 100% with the squad and are endorsed by the Justice Democrats. But they don't really have the high profile or they're not women. So I think there could be a development of a left-wing caucus, because one of the big news stories outside of Chris Kobach losing from this week is that all these left-wing candidates are winning. I mean, there was a left-wing candidate who beat Elliot Engel, I think that was his name, in New York, who's probably more left-wing than AOC. There was a candidate who won in St. Louis who beat a longtime powerful Congressional Black Caucus member. And of course, Rashida Tlaib won her race by a huge margin, despite a lot of money coming in for her challenger. And it looks like Ilhan Omar is going to win her primary. I believe that's up in a week or so. And so they are going to be stronger when they come in. And there is this narrative that the left, despite Bernie's humiliating defeat, that they will go stronger, regardless of whether Biden wins, is that they are building their own coalition independent of a large national figure, and they are effectively advocating for their policies. A lot of their policies that were fringe, 10 years ago are now mainstream in the Democratic Party. I mean, defund the police is now mainstream. Abolish ICE is now mainstream. Open borders is the official policy of the Democrats. So the far left is winning. I think they will form some type of group that's similar to House Freedom Caucus. Whether it'll be effective or not is a question, because most of the squad relies on media, their media presence to get across their point, but they're not necessarily as effective as you would think on Capitol Hill. If they have effective leadership, they'll probably get a lot through, which is not good for America, but it is what it is. So what do you think about these two subjects, Nemitz?
I barely pay attention to politics. I mean, I've seen.
We've got a bad guess. This is a bad guess. So, what do you think about Kobach's loss, and what do you think about these far left Democrats winning in races?
I mean, I wish I knew more about Kobach or the Midwest. I can't really comment there. As far as the far left Democrats kind of winning, I do think we are kind of in a transition stage, in the way the Russian Empire, not in the sense of the extreme violence and the revolution, but just kind of a shift from an identity, from a more like particular ethno-religious group, Americans for most of our history were kind of Northwestern European Protestants with, some other groups kind of thrown in and incorporated within that mindset. Then they kind of shifted into, kind of a broader white Judeo-Christian identity. And I think we're kind of shifting now into a global identity where truly anyone could be an American. And that's kind of where the far left wingers are coming from. They believe in that identity and kind of drawing their policies from that identity, how it kind of naturally goes forward. I mean, if all the races are equal and anyone really can just show up and take a test and become an American, it does follow that you should allow anyone to come to the country, and that you need to tear down George Washington's statue and all this other stuff that comes with it. And then on the other hand, I do think there is some genuine, so that's one aspect of it. And then on the other part, especially in the larger cities that a lot of these far-left candidates come from, it's very difficult for a large number of reasons. Immigration's one, land speculation's another, general wealth income inequality is a third one, where a lot of people, they go to college, they end up very in debt, they can't afford to own a condo, own a home, so they either end up living very far away from the city and having to drive and spend much of their day going to and back from work, or they just spend 40% of their money on rent, which is about what I pay, and they're kind of frustrated by that. And things like socialism look a lot more attractive when those kind of economic circumstances are taken into account.
Yeah, I think that a lot of people are are attracted to Bernie's message. I mean, they do have so much student loan debt, and as you said, they're spending so much on rent that they're not at the place where they think that their parents were, 30 or 40 years ago, and boomers and Gen Xers were able to, purchase a home or save up money and live the American dream, which the American dream is becoming a lot further away for a lot of young Americans. And the message of socialism is very appealing to them, which, Republicans are wanting to run on this message of socialism bad, socialism versus liberty, and it's not resonating with the public. It's not, 2010 anymore, where socialism was, something that could scare people. People aren't really scared of it anymore. And most polling is showing that a lot of young people actually have a positive opinion of socialism, even though it's not really ever well defined. It just and conservatives just it's like big government doing bad things, I think. And that's socialism. And it's hard to tell people about the horrors of socialism with coming through with single payer healthcare or universal basic income or anything like that are these ideas that a lot of young people are interested in, and them just oh, this is how the communists came in. And millennials and Zoomers have no memory of communism or communism being bad. I mean, the oldest millennial would have been in elementary school when the communists fell, when the Soviet Union fell. So they don't really have a memory of it. They don't really have. It's just something that was like a foreign government that's no longer a problem anymore. So they really can't fearmonger in a way that they could have 10 or 20 years ago about this issue, and that's presenting a lot of problems with the Republicans in the election. So I think that was some very good points that you made about that subject. And, this has been a great discussion today, but my producer's in my ear and saying we're out of time. So Nemitz, how can people follow you and find your work?
You can follow me on Sallow Forum, where I post some stuff, or you can follow me on @Peter_Nimitz, like the Admiral, at twitter.com.
Yeah, Salad Forum is providing it's like a farm team for highly respective of where I should get guests. I'm just going to start scouting out for my new guest on Salad Forum, just finding out new people to bring on. So maybe we'll have the entire forum will appear on highly respected someday. But it is I'm not a Salad Forum member. No, even though people are like, oh, you've written under pseudonym before, but I've never been on Salad Forum, but I do read a lot of the posts there. It is a good place and it is a very enlightening place. And Nemitz has a very great Twitter account. I retweet him a lot, so you should definitely follow him. And you're going to have to spell out your Twitter handle for people to find. You were complaining about how someone's sitting on your handle the other day. So tell people how to find you on Twitter.
It's Peter, Peter, then there's an underscore, then Nimitz, Nimitz.
All right, write that down, kids at home. So make sure you follow Nemitz. And anyway, thanks, Nemitz, for coming on. We'll have to have you again.
Thanks for having me, Scott, and hope you have a good rest of your evening.
You're welcome, man. And until next time, stay respected.